Welcome to the Life Stuff 101 podcast, dedicated to sharing stories and insights to inspire you to always make your mental and emotional wellness a top priority. We talk to people who share their personal journeys and experiences, as well as to people who share their professional expertise. And there'll also be other times when we share personal tips and stories, which will hopefully somehow spark that aha moment for you too. Because we all have those moments when we think, I wish I had known that earlier in life. That's what Life Stuff 101 is all about. Our discussion today is for general information purposes and not meant to be specific advice. For personalized support and specific answers to questions you may have, please consult the appropriate medical or mental health care professional. Now here's your host who's on this wild adventure ride of life just like you. And yes, a real life person who's actually slipped on a banana peel along the way. Mental wellness coach and psychotherapist, Mio Yokoi.
Hello, this is Mio, and welcome to another episode of Life Stuff 101. This podcast is devoted to sharing stories and insights to inspire you to always make your mental and emotional wellness a top priority. If you're new here, welcome. It's awesome to have you and hope you enjoy what you hear. And if you're returning, welcome back. It's super great to have you on this journey with me. So before we get into this episode, I gotta say that I'm super proud that this is the 10th episode of Life Stuff 101. Although technically it's the 12th episode, since there are also episode 0 and an introduction episode where you can learn more about me and what inspired me to start this podcast. But it's amazing to me that at the beginning of this year, which is 2019, this podcast was literally just a glimmer of an idea in my brain. And now it's this thing out in the world with people listening from all over the world. Like, it's mind-blowing for me to see that there are listeners not only here in North America, but also in Africa, Europe. I think it's pronounced Oceania. I'm probably butchering that. I'm sorry, but I'm imagining that would be the area of the world where there are Australians and New Zealanders. But the fact that you're there listening, thank you. And Asia. So I'm so grateful. So thank you so much for being on this ride with me. But today I had an amazing time talking with Cassie Cao, who, first of all, is so charming, sharp, funny, and such a deep thinker, smart as a whip. I've joked about being a systems thinking nerd in the past. I mean, she's the real deal. There's so much to Cassie, which we'll be talking about together, you'll hear. But she's an award-winning stand-up and actor based here in Toronto. And she's been racking up all kinds of accolades, including being selected to take part in New Faces Canada at the Montreal Just for Laughs Festival this year, which again is 2019. And she's also an active member as an educator and understudying with the Second City Education Company. We talk about Cassie, how she found comedy, her take and experiences of being part of the comedy community, and the more nuanced things about the comedy world that we as the comedy audience out from the outside could learn more about. There's a lot to know. And if you're in the Toronto area or plan to be in Toronto toward the end of October 2019, Cassie will be headlining a show on October 24th at the Rivoli. And more details about her gigs are available at her website, CassieCao.com. That's Cassie, CassieCao.com. And we talk about so many things, and I learned so much from our discussion, and I hope you do too. And even though we start off with a fun fact, as we always do on Life Stuff 101, I actually would say that there's actually another fun fact or a fun story that Cassie shares with us about the love of her life at the very tail end, which I think you'll enjoy. Okay, enough from me. Please enjoy my lovely conversation with Cassie Cao. And so before we get into things, I'd like to ask my guests a fun fact about themselves just to start things off. But
right.
but I also thought I'd share a fun fact about me with you.
Yeah, please.
So in my previous life, before I trained and been working as a therapist, I worked in tech on the marketing side of things. So there's always a part of my brain that's kind of like thinking about different ways that tech can solve problems.
Cool.
And there was a tweet or a series of tweets you put out about about dating apps and therapists or therapy. Do you recall that?
I mean, I tweet so much I don't, but please let me know what I tweeted.
So the gist that I got from it, and I was kind of tempted to sort of like jump in there, but which is really cool that like you do this thing on Twitter where I'm just gonna put thoughts out there and a lot of it's so insightful, and the fact that you could be funny in it is I think is really like what a talent.
I appreciate that because I'm always like, this is just mental illness unfiltered, but but I do appreciate it. Thank you.
In terms of like the tweets that at least the sort of the gist of what I remember is, I think the idea is that you were saying is like, wouldn't it be interesting or cool or helpful or something to have like a dating app where therapists could
therapists could set you up with people with compatible mental illnesses.
Right. So what's interesting when I saw that is that I've actually had this idea. Not necessarily like compatible mental illnesses, but I actually think about it from the standpoint of this. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think to myself, it's like, wow, like what if it is that, there is a dating app where people can talk about how much work they've done or like how much of a commitment they have to their personal development. And I was like, that would be kind of a cool dating app to have.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, you can do that on any dating app. It's just called conversation, right? But I've dated a bit, and I just think it's so it's just not very useful to have people talk about how far along they are in terms of their progress and also of their habits. I think I used to be an economist. That's my fun fact. And I'm extremely cynical to what people say. I think everybody lies, or if they don't lie, they don't know what the truth is. Right, and I think you can only observe how people are based on their actions and not really on their words.
Right.
So I think the issue with this sort of thing is that you do have to put in the time and energy to get to know someone so that you can decide whether or not they are the type of person that you like.
No, for sure. You're right. Like, I mean, how do you, apart from actually doing the work of getting to know someone, like how, is there a way though to at least make it a little bit more efficient or make it a little bit more helpful or something like that, right? To give it a little bit more context or something beforehand.
I mean, I think that I developed my own system around it. I'm sure everybody, I feel like you date online long enough, you figure out your own system of how to filter people and things like that. And I will say, like, I think the longer I date, the more I meet people that I like. Whereas, like, I remember when I started online dating, I was like 24 or something. And like, I would go out with like 10, 20 people a year and I would only meet one or two that I liked. Whereas like that ratio has gotten better as I've gotten better at figuring out how to date and what kind of people I like,
So you've developed a system for yourself.
I guess
based on your experience. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, listen, I think so. If you don't, you're just not learning,
Right. That's true. Yeah. So you mentioned that your fun fact is that you came from being an economist.
Yeah. I mean, is it fun or is it not fun?
Well, it's fun in relation to the fact that of the work that you're doing now. I mean, maybe it's just somebody who is like, I'm an economist. Like, okay, well, that can be a fun fact, but it's particularly fun in relation to the fact that the work that you do is being a performer and also specifically as a stand-up.
Yeah, well, I think it's so interesting that people always say like, oh, it's such a 180 to go from being an economist to a stand-up comedian, which like, I guess like outwardly, yeah, of course. But I personally find that they're like extensions of the same thing. Like, I think that, anyway, so I got my master's degree in economics and I was working in the financial district and a lot of public service. And doing really big projects with the government. I worked in higher education for a long time. And that's like the background that I came from. And it's a lot of the types of stuff that I was doing was policy oriented, and it had a lot to do with behavioral economics and how to incentivize people to use certain programs, or how to figure out which groups were being under targeted or over targeted by certain programs and things like that. And it was wildly interesting. I love economics. I personally think that I didn't really fit the 9-to-5 office type of lifestyle, but the job itself, I loved it. And if I could do it like remotely or from home, I would still be doing it.
Yeah, I could sense that like your thinking and your abilities around it is something that is, or even like as you're talking about it, I can get the sense of your interest in it. It's just sort of like the system around it, or the framework in which you would have to work wasn't necessarily your thing, it sounds like.
Yeah, which is really too bad, because I truly really miss the work. And it is in such a way that like I think that I became specialized enough in economics that there wasn't really any freelance type of work that I could do. Like you either have to commit to working in a bank or you can't do it, which is really too bad. But I personally think comedy is just an extension of that kind of analytical mindset, right? I think that being economics, you basically apply scientific principles to human interaction, which is already a very tricky, very imprecise kind of science. But it's the like philosophy of looking at human interaction and determining patterns and seeing what's rational and irrational, and how we incorporate different belief systems and preferences that are not quantifiable, and figuring out the discrepancies between. I mean, I feel like all we're doing is finding the delta between everybody's realities and expectations, or their beliefs and their actions, you know?
So I could see how intellectually it's a bridge that you can gap, but I mean, but how about like practically from a life perspective? Like how do you go from being an economist to being a stand-up or performing?
Well, I mean, I did both at the same time for a long time. So when I first graduated from my undergrad, I was working at the Bank of Canada back in Ottawa, and I was terribly sad there. I really liked my job, but I didn't have much of a social life out there. And I read about the Second City. I think that was around the time the Tina Fey's book came out, Bossy Pants. And I read about it, and I just thought like everything about the Second City that she talked about had a very, it really appealed to me, the philosophy of improv. I was just telling someone this the other night, but like, I don't know if you know about it, but it's like, it's a lot of principles around how to operate in a group, which really appealed to me. It was a lot of like, take care of your partner and your partner will take care of you. The most valuable player is the person who sets you up for a joke, not the person who lands the joke. It's a lot of like, give and take, and listening is important, and always yes-anding and not no-butting other people. Like it had, the philosophy of it really appealed to me. And I thought it was a really lovely way to see the world, rather than, I don't know, I feel like if you're just entering a job market, especially in modern times, it's very bleak and everyone's very defensive and trying to get their own. And it's very like, you know, dog eat dog or whatever. Whereas in improv, it really like trained you to be open to trusting other people and working with other people. And also like, if you fail, you fail together. Only make your scene partner laugh. Don't try to make the audience laugh. You know what I mean? Like it had a lot of really great principles. Yeah. So that really appealed to me. And, you know, she talked about how she made like all her best friends and met her husband through improv and all that stuff. So that just like truly, I really think like sparked a thing in me. And so I tried really hard to moved to Toronto to go to the Second City here. I mean, Tina Fey went to the Second City in Chicago, but I realized there was one in Toronto. And so I transferred within the bank to come to Toronto to do the Second City. And then I did the program at the Second City for a long time. And then I moved into more advanced classes and studios, and I got involved with other theaters in Toronto. And then I ended up, concurrently, I did my master's degree and all that stuff. Like I was still working at the time. So I did comedy and work together for many years. And then eventually I transitioned into doing stand-up. I think that stand-up is more I think it's more what I was particularly looking for, but I do think I wouldn't have gotten there if I hadn't gone through improv first.
Well, it's interesting because what you mentioned, or at least in what I was hearing anyway, is that in Ottawa you were pursuing career-wise what you were looking to do, but then noticing that there was maybe an isolation or a loneliness, and through Tina Fey's book, and specifically around sort of the framework of the collaborative nature or the sort of the community nature of improv. Mm-hmm. That is really what, like you were saying, like there was something about that was like, oh, this is about people, or this is about a way of being with others, where it's about being supported, and I could see how that would speak to you when you were feeling isolated.
Yeah, I mean, I was never terribly social as a kid. Not that I was bad at it, but I moved a lot when I was young. I never made any like super long-term friends or anything like that. And I was always pretty independent. Like I loved spending time by myself, so I wasn't terribly needy of other people's attention. So I never really developed any very strong friend groups or anything like that. A lot of my friends would be like one-on-one, or eventually I would move and it wouldn't be a big deal. Like I never put that much emphasis on creating a really structured like social support network. And so when I came to Toronto and I started getting involved in comedy, like a lot of it was just expanding my world. And now I have access to hundreds of comedians, not only in Toronto, but like across the world. Like now when I go on tour, you just have to go and tap into those comedy communities and say, hey, I'm a touring comedian. And people will want to hang out with you and put you on their shows and want to talk to you. And lots of people, help me find places to stay and gigs and all that stuff and rides. And it's like, I think doing comedy has been the biggest blessing of my life, is that it's really expanded my world and let me have a structure in order to meet new people and experience places and things and ideas in that way.
One of the ways in which I relate to you, and just from going through some of the material that you have online, is that I'm an only child of and I come from an immigrant family. I'm actually a first generation immigrant, but I'm also an only child, and that's I know that it's one of the things that you had shared. Mm-hmm. That you are as well an only child. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if, like you were, some of what you were talking about of not having that need for, these larger social kind of networks or structures, like growing up, mm-hmm. is in some ways like a function of being an only child.
I mean, I guess we will never know because I don't have a counterfactual.
Right.
But I don't really think so. Like I mean, a lot of my friends have had siblings, and especially in like an under 18 kind of scenario, I've never known my friends to be terribly close to their siblings. Like in my experience, people get a lot closer to their siblings when they become adults, and they find it's like really hard to hold on to friends and to have family and community. Personally, I think neither of my parents really emphasized having lots of friends or building communities. I think both of my parents are also very isolating, and so that was just like never a value or a thing that I had seen be really important until I became an adult and started realizing, oh, that's something that I would like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know it's not that I was trying to suggest that people who have siblings are automatically close, to the people that they were born into, or sort of the genetic roulette of like people showing up in your life and your family of origin type stuff. But I think that what you were just saying around like not maybe having a certain way of being with others being modeled for you growing up, you just do what you know.
Yeah, of course. I think that's very common. And also, like I said, because I moved around a lot, and for what it's worth, like I very rarely was just gifted a social circle. Like when I was growing up, when I was very young, up until I was 14, 15, I was the only Asian kid in every school that I'd been to because I lived in the Maritimes. And it was all white kids, and so there is a certain level of distance that you can't really, like I wasn't going to show up and become the most popular kid. Like it just wasn't in the cards for me. So had I ever, I think like stumbled into a scenario where I was so popular, maybe I would have been like, oh, this feels great. And I would continue to seek it, but it was never, not that I was unpopular, but like that sort of thing had never been offered to me. So it wasn't something that I knew to chase.
There was always a sense of difference.
Yeah, I think so.
Difference in some ways was what created maybe some space between you and like social groups sometimes.
I mean, I think that when I was young, I just didn't think about it. I was just like, it's fine.
Oh, no, yeah.
No,
yeah, we just, and that's the reality, right? Like a lot of the times, like we're not necessarily like consciously and intentionally, making these kinds of decisions. Like often we're just responding to the circumstances. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. And it's not like I was like so sad about it when I was little. Like I feel like when I was little, I had other problems going on. I wasn't like, why doesn't this person like, I don't know. It never occurred to me up until I feel like it was until I was much older and I moved out that I started realizing my life was very small and that I wanted that kind of community.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that you actually did take the steps to create that community, it sounds like maybe first through improv and then from there, like how did you make that transition from improv to doing stand-up?
So I had taken a stand-up class while I was taking improv classes. And I liked it enough, but I didn't really do it after I took that class. What had happened, this is more of a convoluted story, but what had really happened was that I quit doing improv. So after I finished my master's degree, I was very exhausted and tired and poor. And that was a really grueling process that I went to. I also had to move out of Toronto. I went to Hamilton to do my master's. And when I came back, I had very little money left and no time and no energy. And I got a job right away, which I didn't think I would. I thought it would take me a minute to get a job, but I got a job like right out of graduation. And so I quit improv at that time. I quit doing everything that was comedy related. I moved back home and I just started doing that job. I filmed a web series at that time and that took up a chunk of that summer. And then afterwards I started working, and that job was both the best and worst thing that has ever happened to me. It was the best job that I've ever worked. I loved my work at it, but I also had a lot of difficulty in the work environment, and I had a lot of growing pains and a lot of I don't want to get too specific about it, but like it was a really turbulent time for me during that time, and it just took up a lot of my energy, like physically, mentally, and emotionally. So I just didn't do anything that full year. And then when I quit that job, I had another job lined up, but I took a month in between those two. And during that month, I decided to do 100 days of stand-up. And so, like, if you're keeping track, I hadn't done any comedy, improv, or stand-up for a full calendar year. And then I decided to do 100 days of stand-up. And but to be fair, like, I decided to do it, and then I quit my job. And then for about 10 days, I didn't do it. And then I don't exactly know what happened, but I went to one and then I thought it was pretty good. And then I went to a second one, and then I started meeting other comics and talking to them, and a lot of other comics. Like, there's a big hustle culture in stand-up. And then I was just so charmed by everyone that was doing it. And I thought everyone was so exciting and interesting that I just kept going. And then I did multiple sets a night for 100 days. And then I think at the end of the 100 days, obviously I started my new job by then, but at the end of the 100 days, I think I did like 300 sets or something like that, like something really wild.
Yeah.
And then I kept going, and then I continued to do more sets. And then I think after 7 months, I think I'd done well over 500 sets.
Wow.
And then I quit my job. I quit my new job.
So when you started doing the 100 days of stand-up, did you have a set?
Mm-mm. I mean, I had a couple jokes, but like, I think this is one of the misconceptions about stand-up is like, you don't just go and do one set 500 times. Like, that's insane that you would go nuts just repeating those words over and over. I mean, I don't know. Maybe some people do it. I certainly don't do it. Like, I would hate it if I was literally just saying those words over and over again. I think one of the greatest things about stand-up is that it's an ever evolving form, I don't think I've ever done the same set exactly twice, right? Like
Right.
the whole point, I think, of doing it multiple times and getting stage time and doing them every single day or multiple sets a night is that you have the opportunity to write on stage and to correct what mistake you made just the set before, and then try it again a different way after. And if it doesn't work, try it another way after. And if it does work, try it the same way and see if you get the same reaction, or try to pause here, pause there. Like there's always some kind of tweaking that you can do to your set. And one of the greatest things that happened when I was doing, like now I don't do this many sets anymore, but at that time during that period, I was doing maybe 15 shows a week on average. And the greatest gift of doing something like that is that at the end of 15 sets in 1 week, you're sick of your own jokes and everyone else has heard your jokes and is also sick of them. And so it puts such a pressure on you to turn over new material as fast as possible. So I was writing at the time new 5-minute sets every single week, which is nuts. Like you can ask anyone, there's no one writing new 5 minutes every week. But like open micers are writing 5 minutes every week because you're telling those jokes to the exact same other open micers every single show you go to. And it's so embarrassing. So you just generate like a shit ton of material when you're doing that many repetitions. And that's why people glorify that hustle culture. That's why like comics in New York will do 9 sets a night. By the end of the 9 sets, like your set's pretty solid. Like you can move on to other stuff.
And, the thing that, as you were talking about the hustle culture, so what I'm imagining is that the community of stand-ups, whether it's here in Toronto or anywhere that you might go in the world, that there is this sense of understanding of what it takes to be able to do what you do and to be able to do it night after night or set after set. But I'm also thinking that there might be some, I don't know, like commonality that might exist within the kind of individuals that do stand up. Is that
How do you mean?
So I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of like mindset, or just a certain like X factor, something that might be true of people who do stand up, specifically who stand up, who literally stand up and say like, this is something that I'm going to do. Right. Or that what you were saying in your experience, that you decided I'm going to do 100 days of stand up. And I'm curious to know, I guess, like within yourself, like what's your sense of what kind of trait it is, or traits that you have that would compel you to do that?
So to answer the first thing that you asked, I don't know. Like, I mean, there's lots of theories as to what brings comics together, and a lot of it is like turbulent childhoods. But like, generally speaking, in my opinion, I'm always surprised by the amount of diversity there is in comedy. As I talk about hustle culture, that is still a subdivision within stand-up. There's certainly lots of people who are against hustle culture as well. There's lots of different trains of thought as to what creates the best comedy. And within stand-up comedy, even within Toronto, we're fractioned into smaller scenes or cliques. And often that's seen as a bad thing, but also I think that cultivates a lot of different voices depending on what scene you come up through. It really radically changes your style. And sometimes that can be a negative in that some comics can get pigeonholed into one certain type, which can or cannot work for them. It kind of depends on that comic. But also what I think is great is I personally don't really have a home base in or I don't feel like I have a home base the way that some other comics do. And sometimes that makes me sad, because sometimes it makes me feel like, oh, I don't belong to a certain scene. But I also think that gives me the opportunity to bounce between scenes. And in my opinion, I think that makes you a stronger comedian, because you're able to work in different audiences and with different shows, with different people that open and close, and having different dynamics and knowing how to deal with all of those things, I think makes you a more versatile, stronger comedian, and makes you consider your material through the lens of many different perspectives. But that's also just what I think, because that's what I'm doing. So who knows?
Right. No, for sure. But I think that from the perspective of perhaps like someone like me who is an observer or a fan or a consumer of comedy, to get some of the insights or like behind the curtain stuff is just so fascinating to me. And
I'm glad. I always, when I talk about comedy, I'm always like, I feel this is so boring to have to.
Oh my gosh! I mean, I think that there's a reason why there's so many like even comedy podcasts or podcasts that are hosted by comedians. On one hand, there is the content of it being funny and people being able to riff and what they do and so forth, which is really, really great. But I think that it's also that from the outside looking in, that there is, at least for me, and like you were just saying, like you're talking from your perspective, I'm just talking from mine, is that to be able to see sort of the inside, from the outside is really, really fascinating. And I think that's my first podcast love, and I think will always be, is like Mark Maron's WTF for me.
Yeah, of course.
And as a result of that, like I really like the delving into the comic, like the actual people behind the comic. It's a job or a role, and it's something that you do, but then there's also the person behind it, and also to understand what the community is like, or what the scene is like, or how things operate. Because I know specifically with Mark Maron, he talks about the 90s alternative comedy scene in LA and New York and stuff like that. So to hear you talk about what the comedy scene is like here in Toronto and your experiences of that, it just seems that seems to be like a part of what it is to be a stand-up comic.
Right.
But with that said, though, in wanting to hear more about sort of like that inside, the behind the curtain type stuff, my sense is that there is like unwritten rules when it comes to comedy, and I'm wondering if that makes sense to you.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Oh, my sense, again, from the outside looking in, is that there are some like unwritten rules when it comes to comedy.
Okay.
And I'm just curious to know if that makes sense to you, or if there's any.
In what way?
Okay, so some of the things that are talked about, or some of the ways in which things are talked about, are often, okay, let me actually try to frame it better myself. So there are certain things that might be considered to be taboo to talk about.
Sure.
Or difficult to talk about, or things that maybe people wouldn't necessarily say in quote unquote like polite society or something like that, where one of the ways in which comedy could be so powerful is that things are said or discussed or talked about or put out into the open.
Okay.
And that, I think, as a result, people will present things from a comedic vantage point. But then if people are offended by it, or if it feels like problematic in some ways, that sometimes people cloak that in this from this standpoint of, well, it's comedy, so it should be okay that I can talk about these things.
Okay.
And it feels like in some ways there are rules or something that comics abide by.
Okay, so I want to preface this by saying I am in no way in a position of authority to talk about this. However, I do have opinions about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think two things to keep in mind. One is that I think that what you are referring to as a comedy audience is the recent surge of like shock and offensive comedy. And that's, I think, not an audience's fault for picking up on it, because it is what is being like peddled by distributors right now. So I think that while that's true, and also like a very thriving large part of the comedy community is people saying like true offensive shocking things, and not to diminish the like validity or legitimacy of that brand of comedy, there is a very vast and large area of comedy that does not do that, and that specifically goes against doing those things, and has like fully different philosophies on what makes people laugh, that is not based in truth or based in shock or based in any of those sorts of things, that also work and that also thrive with other audiences, but are currently out of favor with like clubs and Netflix and any other types of distribution. So like we would generally call that the alternative scene. And that has like ebbs and flows, just like any industry. But I think it's important to keep in mind that like when you're talking about like the rules of comedy, that applies, I think, only to that subset that's currently right now getting a lot of attention. Whereas if you put that rule on any other type of comedian, like you put that on a Eugene Merman, like it's not going to work. So there's like full other subsets of comedians that are abiding by entirely different rules that are equally making audiences laugh and happy and think, that are not doing that sort of stuff.
I guess I'm also sorry to interrupt. So I think about people like Don Rickles, for instance, where I watch that documentary. I think it's called Mr. Warmth. I think that I really enjoyed. And so on one hand, what's interesting from a personal perspective is that the kind of comedy that Don Rickles did, there were certainly like some discomfort that I would feel like watching, you know, the work that he would do. But also, so I guess I'm thinking about this idea of this unwritten rules of comedy, like even like when I'm thinking about Don Rickles, right? Because he was like an equal opportunity, like just went out there and performed. But again, like from the standpoint of it's comedy.
Yes. But so, I mean, I can talk about it, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands that that's a very specific style of comedy. And that's the comedy that people think is what all comedy is, because it's, in the last few years at least, been heavily favored by broadcasters. So that's just what gets funneled to you. But that doesn't mean that other types of comedy don't exist and are also doing great. And there's lots of comedians that are doing other stuff. Does that make sense?
No, for sure. And right.
So like if you want to talk about like the like insult comedy, like I'm absolutely happy to talk about that. I just want to make sure that we, like, I don't want anyone to walk away from this conversation thinking that that is what stand up is. Like, I think what makes me very uncomfortable right now is everybody loves talking about Dave Chappelle and Aziz Ansari and Bill Burr and all, and like and Andrew Schultz and all that SNL stuff going on and like whatever. And that is a very large group of what's going on in comedy right now. But I think it's a disservice to reduce all of the stand-up comedy community to what's going on over there. Whereas there's great comics that you don't know their names because they're not getting Netflix deals, that are doing just as important work, doing fully different things in live shows in alternative scenes.
And thank you for doing that, because that's true, talking about it that way, because there can be, I guess, to maybe define comedy in a very specific way, like based on what seems to be largely out there. Yeah. Or like what you're saying, like that's more largely distributed.
Yes, absolutely. Which is fine. But I mean, it makes me sad to think that people think that comedy is what's on Netflix, because that's what's, I think, really damaging to stand-up comedy, is that the Netflix specials that are being promoted to regular viewers, there's not all of them. Like, I'm a comedy fan and like I scroll through that entire page, and even that is very skewed in terms of what gets represented. But of people that prefer to watch movies and just get a thing popping up on their recommendations every once in a while, it's mostly that Dave Chappelle special. There's maybe 4 or 5 that they get recommended, and those ones are heavily not representative of what the comedy community is and where progress is in comedy and where the most innovative comedy is coming out of. Like, Dave Chappelle, like, no disrespect, is not today's best stand-up comedian. You know, like, he's riding a lot of goodwill that he accumulated over the past 20 years. Whereas I would say today's most innovative stand-up, obviously, like, I'm not in a position to name anybody, but is not someone that is already been famous for 20 years. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So for someone like me, where would you recommend that I would find some of those more diverse voices in comedy?
I really encourage people to go see live comedy. I think I try to talk about this as much as I can, but I mean, I don't have a very large platform myself, but I think that diversity in comedians has to come at the same time as diversity in audiences. The only reason why white men are dominating comedy clubs, and obviously it's getting much better now or whatever, but like historically, the only reason why that's even the case at all is because people who are interested in watching comedy want to watch them. Does that make sense? So the more that there are audiences demanding to see more diverse comedians, stories that have different angles, maybe there are lots of, let me tell you, most people don't care about comedy. As soon as I started working in comedy, I realized immediately most people don't care about people being funny. Like, it's really only comedians that care about jokes. But even comedy audiences that come in, they'll say, oh, the things that you talked about were so interesting, or we liked the way that you like performed, or the way that you moved, or the way that you look. But very few people actually care about the craft of joke writing, which is okay. But what I'm saying is there are a lot of people in this world who don't like the specific kind of stand-up that is being distributed mainstream, like a lot of that shock comedy, a lot of that like vulgarity and talking about taboo subjects and making people uncomfortable and all of that stuff. And I love that comedy. That's not something to say badly about that type of comedy. But what I'm saying is there are a lot of audiences. Well, there are a lot of audiences that think that they don't like stand-up because that's all that there is in stand-up, which is not true at all. And the more that audiences become varied and audiences demand for different types of comedy, the more that the comedians that provide that comedy have more power and stage time and visibility, right? It's a supply and demand problem, isn't it? Like, if there's no demand for diverse comedy, then no one will invest in diverse comedians, right?
Right.
So I think that comedy, personally, I don't really love what's going on with Netflix and stand-up. I think that at the start, like 10 years ago, Netflix was doing really good stuff for stand-up comedy and helping comedians who didn't have a larger audience reach their audiences. And it's done really great things for comedians like Eliza Schlesinger and whoever, who like got into stand-up way earlier than everybody else, who like used to be going through Comedy Central, and now Comedy Central is so saturated. But nowadays, Netflix is not really investing in new comedians or comedians with diverse voices. Netflix is investing heavily in comedians that were already famous and already have a very large fan base from 10, 20 years ago. And now it's making it a lot more difficult for smaller comedians to have any kind of exposure, which is why I think that live comedy is so important. I think it's so important to go out into your local neighborhoods and go out and see a show that's just being put on by your local comedians instead of like angling to keep going to the Cellar. The Cellar in New York is a really great comedy club, but they play the same 20 comedians over and over and over again. And those guys, you can also see them on Netflix and on TV. You're not going to see like those weird alternative acts and people who are talking about weird things in those spaces. Like, they're not going to be crowding into those spaces. Like, those spaces are already oversaturated. Those people are coming up through bar shows or coming up through indie spaces or coming up through community areas and weird other spaces. You know what I mean? And those are where they are starting out. And if you catch them in their development, in their early development, and you like them, that's how they get the heat to move into more mainstream spaces.
As an economist too, like you were mentioning about the supply and demand, right? Of it's possible to find and to have the voices, the diverse voices of different kinds of comedians and styles of comedy. And while not fan of like labeling necessarily, but you know, we talked about insult comedy or shock comedy, that kind of thing. Is there a way in which you describe the kind of comedy that you do?
I don't like to, because first of all, if I'm completely honest, I don't know. And I think any comedian that is 100% confident about how they are perceived are bullshitting you, because there's just no way to know how people think of you. I know how I think of me, and I know how I think I come off to other people, but feedback that I get from other people is wildly varied, and people like you for a variety of different reasons that you didn't even think of. And this is also why I want to talk about like why I like forced us into this like big tangent around the rules of comedy, is that when you boil down stand-up comedy, and one of the things that makes stand-up so pure, in my opinion, is that all anybody can do as a stand-up comedian is go on stage and tell jokes that they think are funny and let the audience tell them if they are funny or not funny. Like, as much as I can tell you, like, I think that this joke is funny because it's set up in this way with the misdirection here, and then this joke is actually about something else that hits on a truth of a thing about the difference between men and women. As much as I can think that, if an audience doesn't laugh, then it's not funny and it has nothing to do with me. In reality, you, as a stand-up comedian, you just learn what audiences tend to think are funny that come out of your mouth. And even the great, great, great comedians get it wrong all the time. You know, like, there's no one who can go out and tell a joke and know that it's going to work. Like, it's not possible.
So I guess the thing that I'm thinking about in relation to what you just said is I'm wondering, from your perspective, what you would consider to be, for instance, a successful set.
I personally, again, just comedians work in full different ways. So there's a lot of comedians that write differently and perform differently and have different goals. So I don't want to speak for anybody else but myself. But when I go on stage, I very quickly in my stand-up career decided to not try to please an audience. So when I go out and do a set, my goal is never to make the audience laugh. Obviously, I would like them to laugh, but I never feel bad if they don't laugh. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like, it's not, I try not to link my success to their laughter, which is an involuntary reaction that is entirely outside of my control and mostly their control as well, you know?
Yeah, and that's actually the reason why I asked that specific question, because, like, my sense from, you know, just hearing you speak just a few moments ago, like, my sense is that wasn't necessarily what you would base your performance success on. So what would it be for you?
So for me, it's a variety of different things. And when I started out, I would give myself small goals to work towards, because that would help me not focus on whether or not people are laughing at me. So when I started, I would, and I still do, like, I give myself small goals in terms of, like, this set, I'm trying to figure out this one joke, or this set, I'm trying to figure out if this pause works. This set, I'm trying to figure out if I can make this joke work without moving my hands. This set, I'm trying to figure out how to, like, hold the microphone in a different way, or whatever, like, all of those things. And if I do that one thing, regardless of the outcome of the set, I feel good that I've done the work that I'm doing. But I think on a broader, like, higher level now, what I like to focus on is, I think the thing that I have boiled down about my own comedy is that, and I think this is true of other people, but again, I don't know, like, I really just think this for myself, is that I think that people like to see me have a good time on stage. And to be fair, that's what I like about stand-up, is that I have a good time on stage. No matter how shitty of a day I've had, if I go do a set, it always makes me feel good. And so the thing that I always try to chase, that I try to put in priority, be above my writing or my performance or my career or impressing other people, all of those other things, which I definitely want because I'm a human person. But the thing that I try to put above everything else is to have a really authentic, pleasant experience on stage. And whenever I feel like I've failed, it's not necessarily because I've had a bad set or that people didn't like me, but I'm only disappointed in myself if I go on stage and I am not happy. Just, you know?
Yeah, that's really, and thank you for that, because I think that in some ways, just on a broader sense, right, that we have, or we base the idea of success on sort of like external factors. And I think that, and especially as a performer, for you to have that sense of where you actually feel the success of each set is actually based on internal factors.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked really hard to, like, design a psychological structure for me to be able to continue working in this space. But I will say I'm pretty happy with the way that I process doing stand-up. And like I said, it always makes me feel good to do it. Even when I do have a bad set, like this past weekend, I was working in Ottawa, and the Friday night show, I always tend to not do well on the Friday night show. Is that I find the crowds are a little bit rowdier. And for whatever reason, I tend not to have as much success on the late shows on Fridays. And I did have a bad show last week. And it wasn't bad in the sense that, like, I don't think that audience left being like, this girl sucks. Like, that's probably not even it. But I just felt like it was a bad energy. It was very adversarial. And I wasn't as lighthearted as what I would like to be. And I did feel bad about it for that night. But I also think there's very little things that I would ever change, you know? Like, I just think if I didn't have that set, I wouldn't have felt bad about it, which means I wouldn't have thought about why it felt bad, which means I wouldn't have put more emphasis on, you know, being in a good mood and not letting it bother me on stage that, you know, people were heckling or whatever. And that probably wouldn't have led me to have certain conversations with other comedians, like dissecting what I could have done better. And then I wouldn't have learned. And then maybe I would have carried that mood into my Saturday shows. So even then, I still think that's a really valuable experience to be having. And I always say, like, people always ask me if I bomb. And, like, to me, that's insane because, of course, I'm bombing. I'm bombing all of the time. And I think if you're a stand-up comedian and you're not bombing, like, you're doing something wrong. Like, if you're not bombing, you're just saying the same jokes over and over. You're not trying different things. You're not being vulnerable. You're not pushing the boundaries. You're not, you know, you're not moving outside of your comfort zone. And if you don't bomb, then you can't feel bad. And if you don't feel bad, then you can't fix it.
Yeah. And I like the multi-layered and the multi-dimensional ways that you're thinking about your experience, rather than what I often notice is that there is more of sometimes a focus on the binary. Is it good or bad? Is it bombing or did you not? Right. But like you were saying, like, yeah, of course you're going to bomb, but it doesn't necessarily mean that in itself is what the meaning of what happened was, right? Like, it doesn't, like that it can actually be a springboard, or it can be just a learning opportunity, just as everything else is.
Yeah. And I think, to be honest, like, if you think that every time it bombs, if it makes you question whether or not you're a good person, whether or not you're funny, whether or not you can have a career, like all of those things, then I think it will be very difficult to have longevity in not only this career, but in any career. Like, in anything that you do, if at any setback, it makes you question the entire structure of everything that you're doing, that's a very large burden to carry with you, and you can't possibly move forward for long. Like, I don't think that's possible.
Right. So there's a need for a personal framework, whether it's in comedy, performance, otherwise, around who you are in relation to what you do, and how you manage challenges, or how you manage or think about or to move forward from difficulties and things like that. If there is an individual that is questioning the worth of who they are, or the sort of like defining themselves based on what's happening, like whether it's a good set or a bad set or whatever it is, that would create difficulties for anybody and anything. Yeah.
I mean, I personally am hardcore into therapy. When I was in my early 20s, became very depressed, and I have worked really hard to manufacture a life for myself that is supportive in the ways that I need it. And one of the things that I think is really crucial is about how to set up, like, the architecture of your mind to be able to support the things that you want to continue doing. And I don't think that that's specifically in stand-up, even though that's obviously how I think about it the most. But I also know, like, people who work in really stressful industries like nursing and like emergency services and things, like, if those people, if anytime someone dies, they take that as a personal failure, they have to exit that industry. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing to do. Like, it's, if anything, you know, often a positive quality that you take a lot of personal responsibilities for bad things or whatever. But if you're not able to create a structure in your mind where the thing that you're doing has greater value than the results affecting your entire, like, identity, then that's just not a sustainable place to be. And you're probably not useful in that scenario. And that scenario is causing a lot of turbulence in your life that's not sustainable, I think.
For yourself personally, you mentioned that you said hardcore into therapy since your 20s. What do you think that it was for you, that understanding of creating that mental architecture for yourself? Like, do you have a sense of like what it was or what it is that had you realize that that's something that would be useful or valuable for you?
I mean, I have my own like issues, just like everybody else. But for whatever reason, like whatever particular cocktails of traumas and experiences that I've had, I've always been a pretty resilient person. And by resilience, I mean, I'm able to absorb negative experiences and like bounce back from them quite quickly. And that's like caused me some problems in the past because I would, continuously hit my head against the same wall many, many, many times for many, many years. But because of that, which I don't know how someone else can replicate it, that is just a quality that I have. Because of that, throughout my 20s, like especially after I left home and I was able to shape my life more the way that I wanted it to be, I started noticing a lot of things about my life and the way that I thought and the way that things that I valued that I think were not conducive or that didn't make sense to me in terms of what I was trying to achieve beyond that. And so I spent a lot of my I've only really been committed doing therapy in like talk therapy in its form for the last few years. I had many therapists before that I didn't like. And so there was a period in my life where I gave up on therapy. But that doesn't mean that I didn't do a lot of that work on my own. And so for me, I think in part because like I said, I tend to have this like weird kind of resilience, which means I think that's also necessary to do things like performance, right? Is that you're able to go out and just get decimated on a stage and still think I could probably do it again. Like, I don't think that's a quality that everybody else has.
Right.
But also because I have a lot of anxiety, and that's something that's really common among stand-ups, because stand-up comedy is very conducive to people who have anxiety and ADHD because it really promotes overthinking, overanalyzing, and nonlinear thinking, right? So that's like tends to be a really good cocktail for people with those particular tendencies. But because I have an extremely analytical personality, I think that feeds in, like, I tend to notice discrepancies between things. Like, if things don't make sense to me, I have a very hard time moving on from them. And so a lot of things that you're taught just as people, I was going to say as kids, but like as people, a lot of things that you're taught to value, a lot of things that you're taught are just like rules of how to behave and how to be a person and how to measure success and how, like, things that you're supposed to want and not want and all of those things. A lot of those things don't line up. And I think a lot of people don't have the excess mental energy to go and question everything. I mean, your life would be a nightmare. Like, the inside of my head is a nightmare, you know? So like, I feel like most people are just like, whatever we say that, you know, having more money is good, great, we'll just like accept that as a thing. And I was never very good at accepting a lot of those rules. So throughout my 20s, like, when I had a lot more space and time to figure out what I wanted and what I wanted to do, and mind you, it was a really difficult process, was undoing everything that I thought was a discrepancy. And it was really painful. Like, a lot of things that I had to unbelieve or unlearn or convince myself that weren't important to me, that I had been taught for 20 years were important to me. Like, a lot of those things had to come down, and I'm still dealing with a lot of that stuff. But that's something that, if anything, is like compulsive, that I need those things to click properly.
Cassie, thank you so much. I mean, I'm very thankful for your time, and I am also mindful of the time. And I feel like there are so many different other questions that I'd like to ask, but thank you so much, though. I do really appreciate your candidness and talking about your experiences and your point of view and your thinking
Oh my
around
gosh.
what you do.
I hope it was good. I just verbal diarrheaed all over your podcast. I hope it made sense.
No, I absolutely do believe that it made sense. And just so that we can cap off, though, because I know that you have to go, and it feels like it dovetails into what you were just speaking about a few moments ago.
Sure.
What is the one thing that you wish that you had actually learned earlier in life or in school or something like that?
Like I said, I think that I'm at a point right now where I try not to regret anything, that I think everything, even if it was difficult, serves its own purpose. So I don't love like these types of exercises where we go like, if we could change something. But that being said, I think the one thing that I wish I had been aware of earlier, because I personally really have trouble with, like, I feel like I wasted a lot of time in my youth not thinking about certain things, is just being aware that most rules are made up by people that are just as dumb as you. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah,
and that's like anything. That's like whether or not you have to raise your hand to go to the bathroom is made up by someone who is just as dumb, if not dumber than you. But also, like, economic growth is also a concept made up by someone who's just as dumb as you, who also has to sleep at night and has to shit and pee and has to eat, and like is, you know what I mean? Like, everyone is stupid, and almost everything that is a rule is made up. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's really great. and it's so true. I think about that kind of stuff all the time. The reality is, like, people made that up.
Yeah.
Everything in our lives, like, people just made it up. So
yeah,
to have that understanding rather than to feel as though it's like some cosmic
and that's not to say that like things being made up is bad. Like, I think it's one of the greatest things about the human mind is that we're able to make up concepts that are so beyond the material world and that everyone can agree to, and, mobilize humans to collaborate in large masses that other animals are not able to do. Like, obviously that's a really great skill, but I do think that it's important to realize that's made up by someone who's no better than you. And if you want to make up new rules, you can, or you can abide by those rules because they make your life easy, but there's nothing magic about it. It's just something that someone made up, and you can make something up as well.
Great. Cassie, thank you again. Where could people find more about you?
I'm all over the internet. My handle is @the Cassie Cao on Twitter and Instagram. I'm on Instagram a lot. I don't know how to get Instagram followers, but I love doing Instagram stories. So please follow me there. And there's so many stories of my cat. I'm on Twitter a lot. And on my website, cassiecao.com, there's a calendar of all of my shows. I try to tour as much as I can. So if you want to see me, message me, and hopefully we can meet up and I can do a show somewhere near you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And just the very, very last thing, because this is the one thing that I've been wondering. What is the name of your cat?
Oh my God, her name is Penny. I have to tell this story real quick. When I got her, I hadn't been doing stand-up yet, and I was an economist, and she's so tiny, and she's so cute, and she was the size of a 6-inch Subway, and she was so adorable, and I wanted to name her something money-themed because I was an economist, and I originally wanted to give her a full name. Like, I wanted a first name and a last name, and I wanted to name her after a famous economist. And then she was so pretty that I couldn't bear to give her an old Jewish man's name. So, which, like, they all are, unfortunately. So, because I just couldn't bear it, I named her Penny. And then she grew up and she started getting these little spots on her back that are brown. And now she looks like she's little pennies on her back. And she's the love of my freaking life. And people love her on social media. Like, people get angry if I don't post about her on Instagram. So please follow her. She's great. People like her more than me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing Penny with us.
All right. Thanks for chatting.
Oh, Penny. How cute is that story? And how great is Cassie? I would love to have another opportunity to talk to her more about her thoughts, her experiences in comedy, and I'm so eager to try to make that happen again real soon. And again, you can find her on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. All of her links will be available in the show notes. And if you'd like to see Cassie live, her dates are listed and available at CassieCao.com. That's CassieCao.com. And again, she's headlining at the Rivoli here in Toronto on October 24th. If you're able to make it, she mentioned that she loves meeting people, so please go up and be sure to say hi. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Life Stuff 101. If you did, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. And if you'd like to share the love, please leave a review to let people know. There are so many great episodes and conversations that'll be coming your way real soon, so please be sure to stay tuned. And as I say that, do podcasters actually say stay tuned? I mean, I don't know. I guess it shows my age where we literally had to tune into things in order to listen to things like on the radio and stuff. But, to be honest, I'll get a kick out of saying it, so I'll probably just keep saying it. So stay tuned. On that note, I hope you have a lovely day or evening wherever you are in the world, and I'll be talking to you again real soon.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Life Stuff 101. If you haven't already, please subscribe so that you'll be among the first to be notified when new episodes are released. Always be sure to check out lifestuff101.com for show notes and to be a member of Mio's Miracle Mob. Because as the wise modern-day philosopher John Bon Jovi once said, miracles happen every day. Change your perception of what a miracle is, and you'll see them all around you.